Welcome to the Unapologetic Heroine podcast, where myth is made manifest. As the author of The Way of Inanna, a heroine's guide to living unapologetically, this podcast is based on Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war who embodies multidimensionality and lives unapologetically true to her heart. We showcase the wisdom of individuals courageous enough to do the same. These are inspiring stories of what it takes to be authentically who you are. My guests honor the wisdom of love, embrace the polarities of being human, and walk their truth. I am your host, Seana Zelazo, licensed psychotherapist, intuitive channel, and author of the book, The Way of Inanna. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hello and welcome. I am thrilled to share this beautiful opportunity to connect with author, scholar, and spiritual detective, Dr. Joanna Kujawa, with many articles in international academic journals, as well as an author in Best Australian Stories. She is also a prolific lecturer on the divine feminine, the Gnostic Gospels, sexuality, and spirituality. Dr. Kujawa also has her own YouTube channel to which you can subscribe, and I encourage you to do so. I am a huge fan of her recent book, The Other Goddess, Mary Magdalene and the Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge. This book is currently available at booksellers worldwide. This is such an important book because it helps us to reclaim the other archetypes of the multidimensional goddess, instead of just the ones that were allowed by the patriarchy to prevail. We are going to dive into some of the key elements of Inanna and sacred sexuality. I feel so blessed to be able to connect in this way. Welcome, Joanna, all the way from Australia.
Thank you so much for inviting me to your podcast, Seana. I love to be here with you.
Thank you. I so appreciate the connection that we have in both being of Polish descent, both having, right? Both having a deep commitment to lift up the divine feminine and help restore her to balance. And we both have a tie to Canada. You did your BA and Master's in Medieval Studies at the Pontifical Institute at the University of Toronto, and I grew up in Canada. And we also share a publisher and a love of Inanna. While steeped in scholarly research, you have found a way to teach the practical application of some very ancient and esoteric practices and perspectives in a contemporary context. How did you find your way from academia into sharing the truth of your mystic self with the world? And why has reclaiming sacred sexuality and these other goddess archetypes felt so important to you?
I think that thank you for this question. It's actually a very personal question that I love to answer. So, yes, how did I get my way? Actually, I had to get my way out of academia. So in a way, it is that, I am a working academic and this is how I support myself. And there are some aspects of my job that I really love. But to write this book, I really had to take a more personal and more spiritual path, which is somehow not necessarily present in all my academic work, simply because academia is structured in a very rigid way. So at certain point, I made a decision not to write an academic book because they're often difficult to read. Not many people read them. And there is very difficult to put a personal element, experiential element in an academic book. Although recently I have read some books that, managed to do this. Some academic books. So this is changing. So this is good news. And I really wanted The Other Goddess to be a personal story. So instead of, although I'm an academic, I call myself in the book a spiritual detective, because this is what I really see myself. And in a way, this book helped me to integrate different archetypes of myself, because for a long time I was struggling with different archetypes, of who Joanna is. It seems like I had several personalities, which you probably can relate to since you're because of your work. So there was Joanna, the traveler and adventurer. Then there was a Joanna who is an academic. There is a Joanna who is a spiritual seeker, very intense spiritual seeker. Because at a certain stage, especially after I left Toronto, and I got a job at the Australian University, Monash University, originally on the campus in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, which I loved because I love the tropics, and which later led me to Australia. I basically decided to claim my own spiritual path, to move away from institutions, but funny enough, the institutions, the academic institutions always supported me on my journey, so to speak, in a practical way. So it was a fantastic experience, but the actually intention behind my travel to Malaysia, which later brought me to Australia, was basically my own spiritual search. And then when I was on the search, first of all, I wanted to explore Buddhism as many Western intellectuals do when they go to Asia, but I started to trip over Hindu gurus, And I studied for several years with a Vedantic teacher, Vedantic guru, so I found lots of wisdom in Hindu scriptures that originally I couldn't find in my own Catholic upbringing, to which I was attached, but it didn't give me any spiritual nurture, basically. And I started to find them too dogmatic, and I couldn't really relate to the divine feminine, and it is presented there. Not that the divine feminine is represented well in Vedanta, no. But at least I found the kind of general spiritual wisdom there with practical advice, which I couldn't find in the traditional Christianity. And that's just my personal journey. And as I was on this journey, I basically was introduced to a teacher who probably wouldn't call himself tantric teacher because it has certain, associations attached to this. He was really a scholar and a spiritual teacher, and I met him in Melbourne. He had an ashram, and I started to study a different tradition called Kashmiri Shaivism, which basically says that consciousness is everything. Not matter as we are being taught in the West, but consciousness is everything, and everything comes from consciousness. But through this teaching also, I started to see that the divine feminine is very prominent in this teaching, because in the esoteric Hinduism, there is a form of Shaktism, which is goddess Shakti, which is this permeating energy of life, which is the joy of life, which is the beauty of life, which is the sensuality of life, and which is a very feminine principle. And I think some philosophers, especially in France, like Henri Bergson, call it élan vital also, just this flow of life. And I found it very attractive. So although I was working as an academic independently, I started with other scholars, translators of Sanskrit for a year and a half, meeting weekly to read the famous tantric work, although maybe not so known as it should be, is the Kula ritual by a 10th century philosopher Abhinavagupta, where I learned the tantric principles and where I had my own tantric experience spontaneously, but maybe not so spontaneously because I was initiated to this tradition and I was studying it with great devotion, but also with great not only spiritual interest, but also academic discernment, so to speak, and so it was a wonderful journey. So I decided that this element, the journey really started with me with Hinduism here, you could say, because I thought that Christianity, and especially generally Western tradition, didn't really have a powerful feminine aspect in the belief systems. And although as I was brought up as a Catholic, we had Virgin Mary, but it is such a disembodied ideal, which was, I would say, created by the patriarchy, as you mentioned before, because it completely disembodies women. It asks for this impossible ideal, which is also completely desexualized and also boxed into the mother archetype. So basically all you could be is a mother. And not that I didn't mean, because it's such a sensitive topic, the mother archetype, but I always felt personally that this is not the only archetype for a woman to live. And I personally chose not to live this archetype, right? So this was also a very personal journey, and it was a great joy for me to discover that there are traditions that, honor this kind of other way of being a woman, also in a sensual way, not in this kind of sublimated way. And then I found my way into Gnostic Gospels, which were discovered in 1945, but there are actually dates are varied from 2nd to the 5th century, written at that time, which portray Mary Magdalene as, a sensual partner, but also a most favored intellectually and spiritually partner of Jesus. So that was very interesting for me, and I threw myself into the study of Gnostic Gospels, and I'm still there. So it was kind of interesting return for me to Western belief system. And then I started to notice as when I was actually in Jerusalem, traveling with 2 other adventurers in the Church of Mary Magdalene, that Mary Magdalene reminded me very much of other goddesses from the West, like goddess Nimna, goddess Inanna, Hathor, Isis, and that she was basically one of them. So I started to ask myself the question who she was, how was she connected to these goddesses? Is it just some kind of mythic archetype that is submerging in our consciousness and emerging more and more from our consciousness? So we acknowledge it, this archetype of a different, wise, sensual, fully empowered feminine that we actually never knew.
Wow.
I'm not
that.
Not sure if it was a long answer to your question.
No, it's absolutely, you touched on so many brilliant points. And what I love about this, what I love about your experience is how you accessed and open to your multidimensionality, which is definitely something that I think Inanna represents. And this is such an important message. And what you're highlighting about this impossible ideal that was perpetuated in that ace, the sort of boxed in non-sexual mother archetype is really important for so many reasons, because what you're conveying here is the capacity to give ourselves permission to be who we truly are and to move beyond limited ways that we're told to stay in our lane. And so this is just a beautiful, beautiful. It feels like the writing of the book for you and your own journey really was this journey of uncovering these different archetypes, but really a journey to self, which is just so beautiful. And truly what is my experience from your book, and having, read the reviews of your book, I know I'm not alone in this, that this book is so powerful in the way that it brings us to ourselves by way of showing us there's this very extraordinary power to reclaim, and you bring it to light. And what I love about the way you bring in the different goddesses is because we may resonate with different ones. There's such a strong pull I have to Hathor as well, right? As well as Inanna. And I just love the way that you highlight that Mary Magdalene is right here with this beautiful group of goddesses that are really being intentional about opening our hearts to ourselves and allowing ourselves to be who we truly are. I so appreciate this. This is why I wanted you to be on this podcast, because to me, you really stand out as an unapologetic heroine. And using your term, I've heard you use the term that you have been radical in your thinking. And I know that this is because my experience of that is that you so beautifully question what doesn't resonate. And it seems your career as a spiritual detective was motivated originally by recognizing that what was being taught didn't feel right to you. In the book, you encourage us to step out of the matrix and into our truth. And ultimately, in the book, you invite us to make the turn now, and to do this without fear. Can you expand, Joanna, on what you mean by making a turn for our listeners?
Yes, and I think thank you for this question. And it is actually a very challenging thing to, first of all, a question and very challenging, but perhaps the most important thing that we can do in our lives. Because as a psychologist, you know that we are conditioned basically to everything, and especially by also especially by our spiritual beliefs, but by any beliefs. We're basically told right from the beginning what we can or we cannot be. And it always felt very false to me. I always had this desire for freedom and authenticity. And I hope that this book, The Other Goddess, is expression of this authenticity. But what does it mean, take a turn now? So basically, we are so conditioned and we are so habitual in our way of acting and thinking and perceptions, of what we can be and what our life should be, or even we believe is, when in fact, sometimes we comply too much, so to speak, to our own narrative, which is very limiting, so we unconsciously live in a limiting narrative of our lives. And what I want us to do, and what I, try to do myself as much as possible, although of course occasionally I fall into fear and so on, it is to make a decision to live a higher, better, more expanded, not necessarily better because sometimes it has a moral connotation and I don't mean this, but more expanded narrative of our lives, and go beyond the boundaries and see that these boundaries are absolutely artificial. So this is what you also do in your book, how can you transcend these boundaries? So this is what I'm trying to say at the end of my book, when I actually had I would call it probably another spiritual experience, when I felt like I just actually was taken out of the matrix, and I just saw everybody rushing to work, checking their mobiles, and I saw how mechanical and artificial it was. And in a sense, we comply with this and live artificial lives without exploring this more compelling, perhaps, narratives of what we could be, right? What we could be. So, for example, I would say, so anything, every moment is an opportunity to make a decision, to take the turn. So, for example, even if you drive to work, maybe drive a different way, go for a different walk. Or very often we do a kind of a compulsive decision making, which basically we do what we normally do. So because I'm a very intense person, maybe it comes across, I don't know. So what I taught myself to do, and it was very difficult for me because of my intensity, it is that if I was really compelled to act in a particular way, which was my habitual way, and I often didn't know how otherwise I could act, I would just walk in a different direction. So I would do the opposite what I would normally do.
Wow.
And then it allows me to push the boundaries away, what is beyond, because, true freedom is freedom from your limited self. Yes, society may limit us, and it does, financial difficulties, that people may experience, and also whatever that limits us externally can limit us externally, but true freedom lies within. And then it means that we have to expand our own narratives of our own lives and push away the boundaries, stretch the boundaries. And what I really like, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels, that basically says, cleanse your doors of perceptions, right? So basically get away from, there's so much more that is available to us all the time. But we put the box around our own consciousness, sometimes, for obvious practical reasons, right? Because we are so busy, just to survive, earn a living, write another academic paper, I'm just talking about my reality, mark 150 papers of postgraduate students, but we have to make space, for the unapologetic part of yourself that says, I am a divine being. And if you're a woman, I am a goddess, and this divine being lives within me. And I'm determined to open the doors for her, which is really me. I'm more than what society expects me to be, or I'm more what I started to believe that I am, kind of boxed into certain roles that we play. And I think that these beautiful goddesses that I explore in The Other Goddess, in Inanna, Hathor, and Mary Magdalene, they were also boxed, even in alternative interpretations, right? So eventually, let's say I'll focus on Mary Magdalene at the moment. For example, even when she was it was acknowledged that she was not a prostitute, so from being demeaned as a prostitute, then she was pushed into the archetype of a mother again, right? Because now she's a rightful wife of Jesus and they had children. And I in a way, and I apologize for my radical thought, I think, but what if she was more than that? Maybe she was like Inanna. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Maybe she stood in her own power and then she was in a relationship with this other great being. And maybe they had children or not, but this is not the most important part, right? Because when people get lost in lineages and, royal bloods, which I think is complete nonsense because I have zero respect for any royalty, So I think so what? This is not important. The important thing is what they came to teach us. They want us to imitate them.
Absolutely.
To embody them. They didn't come here to be worshipped. No great being in any tradition, I believe, didn't came to be worshipped. They came to tell us, you can be like me, right? So you can be like Inanna, and this is beautiful about your book. You can be like Mary Magdalene, the one that I'm trying to rediscover differently from, what was shown before, because I think she's probably the latest version of the same archetype. And, in my book, I sometimes go radical and I say, well, maybe it's this just archetype in our consciousness. Maybe it's actually and what in Hinduism is called avatar, or a great being that keeps reincarnating, right? To pass certain message. I don't know. And I give some other possibilities, but she embodied it like Inanna, like Hathor, for example. And for some reason, I believe that our society is afraid of this empowered feminine, because you have two types of feminine, either, the virginal wife, which is we are allowed, or, kind of kick-ass, very masculine feminine, especially in business and so on, on politics. And for me, I think that this kind of women actually disconnected from the feminine. And what we have to do, we have to rediscover or perhaps create, if it didn't exist in the past, the feminine that is empowered in being feminine, not by imitating men or being, the submissive kind of feminine that the patriarchy allowed us to be.
And so much of what you shared around discernment, around the capacity to see, beyond what is limiting, even in, to your point, what the patriarchy is saying, you are allowed to be this, or however, and what I love is the emphasis on the discernment necessary to make that turn, to step out. And I have heard you mention that academia did support your development of discernment. And what I love about the idea of discernment is it really is clear vision. It's the capacity to see, and certainly a third eye, characteristic, if you will. And what is so important about that is this, what you're highlighting is to encourage our own discernment, so that the idea that the message is true freedom lies within, for sure, is so consistent in, to your point, these great teachers who have come forward, who don't want us to hold them up as royalty. They want us to look at them as examples of what's possible for us, right? So beautiful. I'm so grateful for this perspective and your willingness to be radical in your thinking. That's just perfect.
I think I was just born this way, so I just basically have to deal with this. And I realize that some people can have a reaction to this, but I also encourage everyone to be authentic, so I'm radical, but I am kind, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So in this way. So, and I just wanted to say, maybe comment also on academia and discernment. So I'm very grateful to academia for giving me this discernment, especially nowadays, there is so much things going on both on mainstream media and alternative media. So I can scrutinize things and I can basically have some discernment. However, I would like to make a correction here that academia has its own limits, because it just gives you a particular box as well, right? So for example, you can discuss this only this way or that way. And I think the reason why I prefer to call myself a spiritual detective rather than a scholar, though I am a professional scholar, it is that I want to push these boundaries as well. Certain things are not allowed to be discussed in academia, or you can discuss them only in one particular way. So I use this discernment But I also see the limitations of this kind of perception, which is often very materialistic and, relies on what was already done, not very innovative, perhaps.
And that perspective is, again, what makes you such an unapologetic heroine, because that is so beautiful. It's an invitation. You're again, what stands out is this resistance to be bound, and interestingly, as you're describing this, it reminds me of what you described in the book about the criteria you inadvertently met for your spontaneous Kundalini awakening. And in the criteria, you mentioned non-attachment. And this is a bit of what I'm hearing in this notion of like sort of not being attached to the parameters set, for example, within academia or any other institution, but allowing oneself to know what is true for the self and allowing oneself to follow that path. In the book, you do describe the spontaneous experience that you had, and I really found those criteria fascinating. Would you share about how you just, again, like I said, you do describe it in the book about these criteria. I'd love to hear a little bit and share a little bit with our listeners about that.
Okay, about which specific criteria?
For what occurred in this spontaneous rapture, you found yourself having met certain aspects that were in place in your life at that time that facilitated it.
Yes, so that's true. And, and again, it's controversial, but not intentionally, because it's actually what happened. It is that I read the sacred texts from esoteric Tantra. And like any sacred text, for example, it carries an energy, not only knowledge, not only wisdom, I should say, not knowledge, not only wisdom, it creates certain energy. And I was absorbing this energy because I studied it with great passion and great commitment at the expense of my other engagements, for example, right? Also, I've been already initiated formally into the tradition of this esoteric form of Hinduism by a spiritual teacher. And I already had a very profound experience of basically the time and space kind of raptured itself during this experience. And it was a very powerful experience. And on a personal level, I was just getting over, if you want me to discuss it, a very important relationship in my life. And I was just uncharacteristically dating someone casually. So I fulfilled this, and I was not making any plans for that relationship. I was just basically getting over someone else, right? So when this spontaneous Kundalini experience happened during a sexual act, I fulfilled the last requirement, which was the requirement of non-attachment, because I didn't have plans for this man, so to speak. I didn't have a plan to get married. I didn't have any plans. Right. So this creates certain openness. Right. And often when I talk about it, some people get really upset because they said, oh, but, other tantric teachers say that, you can have it with your partner. And it is a little, so I have to make a correction here that, first of all, I'm talking about one form of Tantra, which is esoteric Tantra from India, which is very different than Taoist Tantra or Neo-Tantra, which is what is adopted in the West most often. But also it is possible to have a spiritual experience through a sexual act, an expansion of consciousness through Kundalini movement with your partner. But you have to be at certain and the tradition allows for it. But you have to have a certain level of spiritual attainment, so to speak, which means you are not trying to do it to improve your relationship. It's not that you have plans about relationships. You're not trying to please each other. It is you're completely committed to the expansion of consciousness and, through the erotic rapture, basically burning all the boundaries and becoming one with the divine mind or the divine energy. So it is possible for two people in committed relationships to have this kind of relationship, but their commitment in this case is to an expansion of consciousness and not to their relationship. Does it make sense?
Absolutely. And thank you for making that distinction. It's very interesting because to me, that is actually a level of non-attachment, right? This ability to be in that sacred relationship with a beloved, but be able to be in a state of deep openness. the idea of non-attachment really struck me when I read about that in your book, because it feels extremely connected with Inanna, in the sense that certainly in the descent of Inanna, wherein she is forced to let go of and strip one of her royal attributes at each of the 7 gates. So there's a message there about non-attachment, and also being a goddess of the death mysteries. And in my own work in End of Life, it's clear that the practice of non-attachment supports our process of transition. And I wondered if you have been able to take that into other aspects of your life, and sort of, do you notice it show up as a priority? Do you practice non-attachment on a regular basis?
It is a very wonderful and very wise question. Thank you, Seana, for this. So it is not easy. And the example of Inanna is a very good example, because basically it shows us that if you want to evolve spiritually in any significant way, you have to take the masks off. Right? And the social roles that we play. That doesn't mean that you have to walk around in the Himalayas with a loincloth,
Mm-hmm.
because most people cannot do this. So you may have to carry on of these masks. Like my mask is also, to provide me with, financial well-being is academia, right? So I carry on this, right? But you have to remember your priorities, that this is in support of your spiritual journey. Mm. And it's very difficult to do it because, as you know, in every profession, there are like high requirements, and they want you again to be boxed in a particular way, whatever profession you have, and they take up all your time. And you have to set, and you talk about it in your book as well, set, sacred boundaries. Like, if this requires me, giving up, my spiritual journey, then I have to put it in place. Although the whole society, and especially my ego, was screaming, because I used to be, and I guess on some level still am, quite ambitious and competitive, and I have to kind of tune it down, you know what I mean? So when I was then, so my academic colleagues, climbing the ladder, and meantime, I'm studying some esoteric tantric text, instead of publishing papers, everybody thought, what happens, to her? She was so promising, right? But I committed myself completely to this journey, not because necessarily I even made a conscious choice. It was, and I think it is not only part of my personality, but it's part of awakening, especially Kundalini awakening. You cannot not stop. Now you're on the path. Now you see what is possible, and you cannot take a lower path. And the path of the ego, although necessary as long as you are embodied, unless, you can go into a cave and meditate, it is a lower path. It's part of us, but there is different reality beyond. And if you want to commit yourself to this, then you have to make the choices, take a different turn. But sometimes I was not making these choices. Sometimes, like, higher power made these choices for me. So, for example, certain doors were closed for me, Mm-hmm. And then I was kicking and screaming and, swearing at the universe, but other doors were opening, but maybe not professionally, but spiritually for me. I was, meeting the greatest minds, spiritual minds, like, effortlessly in my life. And I learned immensely from them. But, my ego, if I can make this kind of distinction, was screaming. So it was, at time, it was a complete agony. So I had this Kundalini awakening 19 years ago, and I can say that only now I'm fully integrating it. And somehow, in strange ways, this book, The Other Goddess, which was not my intention at all when I was writing this book, helped me to integrate it. And I'm not sure why. Maybe because I was using, vocabulary from your book, unapologetically authentic. Especially in part 1, I talk about very intimate parts of my life, right? Which were connected also with spirituality for me. And I basically said, okay, this is me. And this is how I embody, this archetype. This is me, how I'm reaching out to this archetype. This is, as much as I can. This is my journey to this, because I'm in no way, at the end of a journey of growth. Right. And this is, and for me, it is really a journey, not only of spiritual detective, but also of adventurer, because for me, the most important part, apart from knowledge and spiritual commitment, is experience. And this is what I write about academically, about spiritual experience, So it has to be experiential as well. So in this book, in We Are the Goddess, I wanted to share the experience of that journey, which is adventurous. It is a very interesting journey, but, it is a very challenging journey. You cannot go on an adventure and think that every train will be on time. Maybe there are no trains, or the train will take you in a completely different direction. And you have to be okay with this. And that's extremely challenging. And especially your ambitions and your plans for your life are going to be mercilessly challenged, right? But it encourages your growth. So this is an adventure, and it's wonderful to surrender to this adventure, but it's a challenging adventure.
Oh, yes. It is.
Sure
It is. It's very much that descent energy. And I love what you said about, I definitely relate to the ambitious, competitive energy, and how you shifted is so beautiful, because to me that reflects the integration when we explore what's really behind the drive. As we deepen into our evolution, we might see those masks might fall away. They're very useful, when you have this strong will and this motivation and dedication and drive. But it at times, if we're really honest with ourselves, we can explore and see, are any of these being motivated by wounding? Are they,
That's right. And they definitely are. And they definitely are, So in my case, I don't even touch about it really in my book, but in my case, I was put in a situation, it often comes to early childhood. As a psychologist, you would know, it was like, to survive, I had to basically tell people who are closest to me, I will show you.
Wow.
And then I had to be the best, right? Because of complexities of that situation when I was a little girl. So, and then you have to think, but what is beautiful when your Kundalini is awakened and you're on a deep spiritual path, and it is also very painful that every time you go into this old pattern, you get a beating.
Yes, exactly.
It's like the universe is telling you, why are you so stupid? Now you're supposed to take a higher call and you're still following it like don't know better, So it is brutal sometimes, but it is just like somebody hitting you on the head, like, what's wrong with you? Do you, don't you know now? But this is not the way of doing it. So, but it's very tempting because these are established patterns, and it's good to be the best.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Joanna, I love that. Because so many listeners are going to be able to relate to that. Like this way in which you are showing and being honest with yourself of the temptation to be hooked back in. And it's just powerful. This divine feminine consciousness, this energy that you were able to access. It definitely is I would say, an invitation to be unconditionally loving to self. And so what emerges are patterns, right? That say, is this the most loving way in which we want to engage with self? So it's very beautiful to honor that commitment and to see yes, if we go back to our old ways, the universe will, or the goddess will ask us if we're sure we want to do that. And to your point, we might get knocked on the head of it. Absolutely. I'm so grateful for this wisdom. And I know that, Joanna, you have a course that has just been released, the Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge through Sacred You at sacredstories.com. And I can't wait for this class because it's going to enable individuals to really have the support to integrate the wisdom of your book. And I cannot recommend it more highly because this is what we need right now. This is exactly the teachings that will help us to shift into a higher perspective, and that perspective, make that choice you were describing, which really ultimately is a choice of love, and move away from fear. So can you tell us a little bit about this exciting class? I know that it's launched, and can you share a little bit about it?
Yes. So this, and thank you for recommending the course, Seana. So the course has actually 5 modules, and each module has a 1-hour lecture with PowerPoint slides. And I try to, illustrate it with beautiful images. It has a guided meditation and has a structured journaling part, because I want it to be also, not only knowledge, but also integration of the knowledge and self-reflection. So basically integration, right? So each module has this. So I'm trying to remember now. So the first module is basically introduction to the goddesses of Eros, and I mentioned Inanna there as well. And I talk about what is erotic rapture and what is sexual alchemy, and I give examples, and I share also some testimonials. Now, then I also discuss tantric goddesses. I discuss Mary Magdalene and how she was portrayed in the Gnostic Gospels, and as a partner and as a divine wisdom that was walking along Jesus. And also I'm discussing how the goddesses of Eros and secret knowledge were hijacked by the mainstream beliefs, spiritual religious beliefs. And I believe that it was not innocent, but I primarily focus on how they were suppressed. And the last module is basically about how we can reclaim them. And when I discuss tantric goddesses, apart from, because I discuss Western goddesses also, like Nimna, Inanna, Hathor, and Isis, along with Mary Magdalene. I also discussed 2 Hindu tantric goddesses, 2 very different goddesses, which is one is Sundari, which is little known in the West, and one is Kali, which is very well known in the West, but I think completely misunderstood, by Western culture. And they are both actually tantric goddesses. And both in the course, in the book, I stress how actually Sundari is a different version of Kali, which is basically Sundari is the erotic goddess of secret wisdom after, Kali experiences love, basically. So, and that's why she's a goddess of 3 dimensions, basically, because she integrates everything. So in a way, the way you discuss Inanna, and I believe that all of these goddesses are basically representations of the same archetype. Mm-hmm. So I think that the course gives, some people don't like reading books, but also the course stands in by itself, right? So it is visually really attractive, I think, and gives you this practical element of guided meditation and structured journaling, and 5 modules, which I think is not overwhelming, right? Because originally I thought maybe 6 modules, but I decided to do 5 modules, and I think that was a very good choice.
I am so excited for listeners to experience this class. And I love the practical application, the meditation and the journaling. It's such a profound way to integrate the material. I'm so excited for it. I will absolutely link the course in the show notes so folks can access it. And Joanna, I am so grateful for your time and the knowledge that you shared with us today. As a leading teacher of Goddess Consciousness, your insights are invaluable. Tell us where we can find your book, your class. Oh, I'll put the class notes in, the class link in the show notes. But also, I would love to know where to find your other wisdom teachings.
Okay, so I think the best way is Amazon.com. And the readers also can have access to the reviews of the book, right? Via the goddess Mary Magdalene and the goddesses of Eros and secret knowledge. I'm also active on my Facebook page, with a public Facebook page, which is Dr. Joanna Kujawa, author. And every couple of days, I try to post a reflection, and some insight, right? And also some personal stuff, because I love to connect with people. And I also have a YouTube channel, Dr. Joanna Kujawa, Spiritual Detective. And I'm also on on which is quite recent, but I actually enjoy Instagram. So any of these venues, on social media are probably the best. But I think the best way to connect with me is actually through the book or through the course, because this is where I give what I have in a very, I hope, I would say unapologetic, but I would say also very, I think, authentic. I try to be as authentic as possible, so this is the best way.
Wonderful. And I'll make sure that's all included in the notes. Thank you so much, Joanna, for being here. And to our listeners, thank you for sharing this sacred time with us. May you experience fulfillment on every level and in all directions of time with great ease and joy. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Unapologetic Heroine podcast, featuring remarkable individuals living their truth. For more wisdom on how to support your own journey toward honoring your heart and courageously alchemizing our world through the power of love, pick up my book, The Way of Inanna, A Heroine's Guide to Living Unapologetically, at booksellers worldwide.